We're really delighted that Malik Yakini could be here. I think he really needs no introduction. He is the founder, he's the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which happens to operate a 7-acre farm in Detroit. He has many other activities and contributions to well-being of people in Detroit and worldwide. I think without further ado, I'll just welcome Malik, and then once he's done, he'll take a few questions and answers, and then we'll move into our panel, which is our discussion together. Thanks.
Good morning. It's good to be back in Ann Arbor. So I always, whenever I have the chance to talk before people, always begin by giving praise to the Creator and to my ancestors, because for me, this is a spiritual work. I'm not trying to impose that belief on anybody else. I'm just saying that's where I'm at. And so I'm rooted and grounded in that, and so I always have to put that before me, and that's the platform that I stand on. Also, just a slight correction in Karen's introduction, I'm one of the co-founders of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And people often make that mistake, and when that happens, it minimizes the contributions of the several other people who were co-founders of the organization. So I just want to lift them up. Also, I want to recognize our board president, the mighty, mighty, mighty Dr. Monica White. Please stand. Dr. White is working on what will be the definitive book on the history of black agriculture in the United States. Make sure you get it.
No pressure.
And what's the publication date?
Soon come.
Soon come, right? And I also want to, let me say this. Whenever I start calling names, I always get in trouble because I can't possibly call everybody's name here who's a friend or comrade. So forgive me, I'm only going to name 2 people, but there's many people in the room who I love and respect and work with closely. But I do want to also recognize Eric Holt Jimenez, who's the executive director of Food First, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. And Eric is the executive director. I'm honored to serve on the board of Food First, and also I consider Eric to be one of my teachers. I'm learning a great deal from him, from his talks about capitalism and its nature and how it actually functions in the developing world. So it's very good to have you here in Michigan. And he had a whirlwind speaking tour earlier this year where the theme was Black Lives Matter. So I appreciate so much you lifting that up and connecting that with the work of food sovereignty. And I also want to say that I stand unapologetically and firmly with those who across the country over the last couple of years have been affirming that Black Lives Matter, and that for the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, we see the work that we're doing as being very much tied to the historical struggle of African people in America for self-determination and self-definition. There was interesting conversation earlier, I think, in response to Christina's presentation of one of the last presenters about terminology. And while I do identify with the term food sovereignty, I don't really quibble with people if they want to use the term food justice or food security. I think what's important is the quality of the work. And I think we find that language is often imprecise, and language tends to evolve over time as our understanding evolves. So I think food sovereignty is an excellent term. When we started our organization in 2006, we had just become familiar with the term food security, so we call our organization the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. But we realized that the work we're doing is really much more closely aligned with food sovereignty than it is with the concept of food security. But we think both are important. We think food justice is important as well. I also want to lift up that the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, thanks to Brother Naeem Edwards and Tiffany Carey, has a relationship with some of the grad students here at the Environmental Studies at the University of Michigan. A few weeks ago, we held the first annual Bio Blitz at D-Town Farm, and we think that it's important that we have constructive and creative relationships between academics and those activists who are on the ground actually doing that work, and we think that this Bio Blitz is an example of that type of work that academics can engage in to support the work that's happening on the ground in places like Detroit. So I want to tell you briefly about the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, and then I'll get into the crux of my talk. The Detroit Black Community Food Security Network was founded in 2006, and we were founded largely because in my travels around the country, particularly to convenings of the Community Food Security Coalition, it became clear that across the country, much of the work that was being done, that was being called either food sovereignty, food security, or food justice work, was being done in either African American or Latino communities. But many of the people leading the work were well-meaning whites who were affiliated with nonprofits that were often well-funded, and they often came into our communities more like missionaries as opposed to allies, because they had not gone through. You say money? You say it's related to money? Oh, okay, thank you. I got you. Thank you. Because they had not gone through a process of divesting themselves of the antiquated thinking associated with this global system of white supremacy. And I agree with Christina, she's absolutely right. White people have a lot of work to do. But for that matter, we all have a lot of work to do. It's just the work varies slightly depending on how we, kind of where we fit into this matrix. But we all have a tremendous amount of work to do. So we were concerned, and when we looked at Detroit, we saw essentially the same thing happening in Detroit. The major organizations leading the work at that time were predominantly white nonprofit organizations. And again, they were well-meaning, and not to say they weren't doing good work, but often because they hadn't really grappled with their own privilege and how they relate to the system of white supremacy, were coming into communities and setting themselves up almost as overlords over the majority African American population. So we were concerned about that. Many of our founding members have been longtime activists in the Black liberation movement, and I know that's not a term that's used much anymore. People like terms like social justice now, and that's fine. I can work with that. But frankly, most of us were activists in the Black liberation movement. And so while we appreciate white allies, we don't take kindly to white people coming to our communities and telling us what to do or leading anything. We think that folks should come in and be supportive of the work that's happening on the ground. It should support the right of African American people and other ethnic groups within this country to have communities that are self-determining and self-defining. So we formed in 2006 to make sure that African Americans had both a robust voice within the burgeoning food movement, but also, since we're the vast majority of the population in the city of Detroit, that we were in the leadership of that movement. Not just that we were at the table, but we think it's important, again, that communities lead themselves and that they define for themselves what their aspirations are and how they should go about realizing those aspirations. So we have 4 core programs that we continue to operate, the most well-known of which and the most labor-intensive of which is D-Town Farm, which has been mentioned, I think, a couple times today already, which is a 7-acre organic farm, which is both a production farm and probably more importantly, a teaching institution. While we do produce tremendous amounts of food, the reality is what we produce on D-Town Farm is not having more than a minuscule impact on the access to fresh, healthy food in the city of Detroit. I think the larger impact, though, that we're having is in terms of the social discourse as related to the food system, who controls it, who benefits from it, who profits from it, and trying to instill within members of our community a sense of agency. That is, that we have the right and the responsibility to determine what happens in our own communities in all aspects, actually, but particularly as it pertains to the food that we consume. So at D-Town Farm, we grow more than 30 different fruits, vegetables, and herbs over the course of the year. Many of those are seasonal, that we sell primarily at farmers markets and also at the farm. We sell to a few wholesale customers. We have bees and apiary operation. In fact, our chief beekeeper is in the back, Brother Karanjev. Mamadou, raise your hand, please, so they know who you are. Now, I respect the beekeepers. In the interest of transparency, let me say I am not a beekeeper. But I respect those who do that. And so, of course, we raise bees both for pollination of the crops and also for production of honey, which we sell. We also have a large-scale composting operation, And that's headed by our farm manager, Kadiri Senefa Ra, who's doing an excellent job at producing compost for our own use at the farm. And we're hoping that at some point in the future it will be legalized in the city of Detroit. And we have Sister Catherine Underwood, who's been described as the godmother of urban agriculture in the city of Detroit, who's working who's working very hard on the next iteration of the urban ag ordinance, which I hope will address composting. I'm not sure. I know it's addressing bees and goats and chickens and things like that. But so we're not selling compost on a commercial basis yet, at least not openly, because it has not yet been legalized in the city of Detroit. But that is how we restore soil fertility at D-Town Farm. And it's really the core of our operations, probably the most important thing that we do at the farm, in addition to kind of planting the seeds of consciousness in members of our community. So in addition to the farm, we also operate a youth program, which is called the Food Warriors Youth Development Program, and that's operated really since the founding of our organization in 2006. And so we teach young people about food justice, food sovereignty, food security, about how to build raised beds gardens, about the importance of nutrition and exercise and movement. And we realize that this struggle is an intergenerational struggle. I am in many ways a child of the 1960s. I came of age during a very tumultuous time in the United States when the Black Power movement was at its height. And Detroit, of course, was a hotbed of Black consciousness, so I came of age in that context. And during that time period, we were often very naive about what it took to make the kind of long, deep structural changes that are required in order to really, truly have justice. And we often thought back then that in the next 2 or 3 years that there was going to be a revolution in the United States. And we used to use terminology like, yeah, brother, when the deal goes down, because we thought, in the next few months or something, it was getting ready to pop off. And so, and were it not for COINTELPRO, perhaps that would have happened, actually. But we realize now that this kind of deep change requires time, and it not only does it require time, it's intergenerational. And so if we're going to have sustainability, not only in terms of agriculture, but also in terms of this movement, that we realize that we have to have young people who are involved. And so our Food Warriors program is designed to foster the development of food warriors who will continue the struggle. We also have a lecture series called the What's for Dinner Lecture Series that is at the Museum of African American History. We have 4 lectures per year because we realize that only providing greater access to food is not in and of itself the solution, but that has to be coupled with a robust public education campaign, because we have bought so much into this convenience kind of fast food culture, and we've been so removed from many of our foodways that just providing access to fresh food is not enough, but we have to also impact people's consciousness. So the lecture series is designed to do that. But we're also concerned about how we obtain food on the retail level. In the city of Detroit, we have 70 or 80 grocery stores, many of which are owned by Chaldeans. And I always like to clarify, I'm not anti-Chaldean. This is not an attack on Chaldeans. That's not the point. But the point is, in a city which is 83% African American, according to the 2010 census, and to have 90% or more of the food stores owned by another ethnic group, which largely extracts the profits from those stores and takes them out of our community, doesn't provide much employment, certainly doesn't provide opportunities for ownership, and does very little to empower the communities that we live in. That kind of model is obsolete, and we push back against that very hard. And so, again, this is not an attack on Chaldeans, because if you go to Black communities throughout the United States, you'll find that the same situation exists, although the extractors might be of a different ethnicity. And so it's really this extractive kind of economy that we're pushing back against. And we think that within the context of a capitalist system, which, by the way, we are against, we are anti-capitalist. And sometimes in university settings when I do that, that doesn't resonate. When I say that doesn't resonate with people. Okay, so yeah, great. But we think that capitalism is a pretty horrible system, both for human beings and the other plants and animals with which we share the planet, and that many of the social ills that we face throughout the world can be traced to the spread of global capital, which puts profit over people. So within the context of a capitalist system, we think that cooperatives are really the best opportunity that we have to galvanize collective power and to aggregate our buying power in a way that builds power for communities. So we have a buying club which functions once a month, which has functioned since 2009. And we're also working very hard to create the Detroit People's Food Co-op, which will be a full-service cooperative grocery store in the city of Detroit. Say it again? Recreate, did you say? I don't know that the Detroit People's Food Co-op ever existed. There was the Cass Corridor Food Co-op, so we're certainly building on that legacy, but we're creating a new mechanism that is rooted within that legacy. I'll put it like that. So as we're developing this cooperative grocery store, we are running smack against the realities of corporate capital in the city of Detroit. And there's been, many news stories about the so-called revitalization of Detroit. There's various terms that are used to describe what's happening in Detroit. And it's true that we see in certain areas of the city that we see tremendous amounts of capital being poured in, and we see tremendous amounts of development, particularly in Gilberttown, which some people call downtown. There's 7.2 square miles. Downtown is seeing tremendous amounts of capital, but we're also seeing things like Gilbert having his own private security force, which has the power to arrest people. We're seeing security cameras throughout the downtown area, which are controlled by Gilbert's security force. We're seeing things like the Hance Farm project, which was very controversial a few years ago, where John Hance bought a huge tract of land, which we think is a very dangerous precedent. You might know that Detroit is 139 square miles or so, and about 1/3 of the city is vacant land. And so there's tremendous land grabbing going on right now in the city of Detroit. And we think a very dangerous situation exists if the city leadership doesn't change the way it thinks. Right now, city leadership, and most, I think, probably urban planners and elected and appointed officials function within kind of the logic of capitalism, which suggests that the market dictates what you do with everything, including land. And so in the city of Detroit, we have the very real possibility of a few wealthy white men buying huge tracts of Detroit, so that maybe in 20 years, we'll see that 1/3 of Detroit is owned by 3 or 4 people. So we are running smack against that as we struggle to build this grocery store. We're also kind of seeing how financing works. And again, the logic of capitalism dictates that those who have the money get more money, and those who don't have money ain't got jack coming. And so that's kind of what's happening. So we're struggling within that context. So I mentioned earlier that Detroit is, according to the 2010 census, about 83% African American. It was at that time at least about 10% white, about 6% Latino, about 1% Asian, and below 1% Native American. So the vast majority of the population continues to be African Americans. And I don't have a lot of time to get into this, but history, it's very important to situate things within a historical context. And so kind of understanding this journey of the African Americans who now form the vast majority of the population of Detroit is critically important if we're to understand what's happening in Detroit now and really understand the issue of food sovereignty. And so we know, of course, that the vast majority of African Americans are descendants of Africans who were enslaved and whose labor provided whose labor was really the engine that provided the wealth that fueled the Industrial Revolution, both here in the United States and in England. In fact, the major industry in England during the late 1700s and 1800s was the cotton industry. The cotton mills got more than 70% of their cotton from the southern United States. And of course, the insurance companies and the bankers in New York benefited tremendously. So not only was the South developed as a result of the labor of enslaved Africans, but the entire economy of the United States, which is why myself and many other people support the call for reparations for African American people, because we'll never have economic justice within this capitalist system, and particularly unless we have some kind of massive redistribution of wealth that recognizes the economic value that the labor of enslaved Africans brought to this country, and the labor of Africans after formal slavery was over in the forms of sharecropping and other forms of tenant farming. So, how much more time do I have?
You got 12 minutes.
I got 12 minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
great. I can do a lot in 12 minutes.
Yeah.
So many of these African Americans left the South beginning in the 1920s and continuing through the 50s and early 1960s to come to Detroit because of the promise of greater economic prosperity that the automobile factories and the other industries that fed into that provided. And so many of them brought with them this rich agricultural history, but also there's always been kind of this twofold relationship between African Americans and agriculture. On one hand, it is very much a part of our culture, and even as those blacks came from the South, many had gardens in their backyards and side lots and what have you. But there's also this kind of, in some senses, a sense of resentment associated with agriculture because of the forced labor that we associate with that. So, you know, at D-Town Farm, when we have elders from the South that come out and visit our farm, we kind of get two reactions. Some people really resonate with it and it reminds them of their childhood, and other people say, man, I used to do this when I was a child. My grandmama made me go out and pick whatever, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. And so part of our work is really to reframe agriculture within the lens of self-determination, as opposed to seeing it as something that exploits our labor to create wealth for other people. So again, that's a long story looking at the history of African Americans who form the vast majority of the population in Detroit. But as we talk about food sovereignty in Detroit, we can't really understand it without understanding it within a historical context. So what are some of the things that this majority African American population, along with the other residents of the city of Detroit, are faced with right now? And we see over the last few years tremendous erosion of democracy with the imposition of an emergency manager over the city of Detroit. And interestingly, on the way here, I was listening to WDET, and they were interviewing Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager, who's currently in Mackinac, where all the big decisions are made about what's going to happen to Detroiters. And interestingly, also for the first time this year, the Kellogg Foundation had issued a report on racial equity, making the case to the business community on why racial equity is important from a business perspective. So there's some of that discussion going on today, but I'm told that's the first time that race was explicitly discussed in Mackinac for many, many years. So we see this tremendous erosion of democracy, not only the imposition of an emergency manager on the city, but the school system has had, I think, 4 emergency managers. We see continued privatization, continued loss of jobs of people who work for the municipal government. We see very high auto insurance rates. In fact, some statistics came out earlier this year that said that Detroiters pay more than twice the national average for auto insurance. And so we have a tremendous number of people who are driving around without real insurance, with a certificate they got from somebody, for $25 or whatever. And so that becomes a problem because people are criminalized because they don't have sufficient money to meet all of the expenses associated with living in Detroit. And we have a very poor public transport system, and so it's very difficult without a car to really handle business if you got 2 or 3 things to do in a day if you're dependent upon the public transportation, which was intentionally underdeveloped in Detroit because of the auto industry. We also have water shutoffs, and there's been a great deal of talk about that over the last few years. The United Nations came into Detroit last year and issued a report that said that the city of Detroit was violating the human rights of Detroiters by cutting off water. And we see a new round of water shutoffs, which is taking place, I think next week it starts, where we have thousands of Detroiters whose water has been shut off. We have the position that access to clean water is a human right, as we have the position that access to good as we have the position that access to good, clean, healthy food is also a human right. We have schools that continue to fail, a very dismal graduation rate, and even those who do graduate are inundated with a constant, steady flow of Eurocentric thought, know much more about the history of Europe and its descendants than they know about themselves, and consequently see the world through the eyes of Europeans. And so for us, part of this work of self-determination and self-definition has to do with reclaiming our history and reclaiming our culture and reclaiming the eyes through which we see the world and the eyes through which we see ourselves. Carter G. Woodson, in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, written in the 1930s, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, in fact, Monica, you know that quote exactly? But he said something like, if...
Read your mind.
I thought about the back door.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know it exactly.
Verbatim.
Well, give it to us. Give it to us, basically.
If you educate using frames that are not consistent with their identity, you don't have to worry about them wanting to come through the back door. They will insist on coming through the back door.
And if one doesn't exist, they'll cut one for their own special benefit. Thank you very much, Monica. And so that's still very much true. And so we know that throughout the world, as colonialism embedded itself in what we're now calling the global South, that part of what followed the kind of colonial governments were colonial schools in order to train a class of people who would manage the infrastructure and who would see the world through the same eyes as the French or the British or the Portuguese or the Spanish or whatever the case may be. And so we know the same thing with First Nations people here in the United States and Canada. The same thing was done when children were taken out of the homes and put into schools. So essentially a white mind could be put into their heads. And so when we talk about schools in the city of Detroit, not only are we talking about whether or not people can read or write, but we're also talking about whether or not they see the world in a way which is consistent with their own history and culture, and a way which is sane so that they can function in a way that benefits the community that they're a part of. I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to move into hyperspeed. So we're also faced with, this thing that people sometimes call gentrification. I don't know if that's the best word to describe what we see happening in Detroit, but we do see huge numbers of young whites moving into areas, some of these same areas that I mentioned earlier, that are being highly capitalized and who, which are being touted as the kind of benchmarks of this revitalization of the city of Detroit, and then we see the vast majority of the neighborhoods without that kind of infusion of capital. And so that's highly problematic as well. So opportunities and challenges, and I'll kind of end with these things. We have more than, according to the Garden Resource Program, we have about 1,500 gardens in the city of Detroit now, either gardens or small farms or backyard gardens, side lot gardens, school gardens. And so we have a tremendous opportunity that most cities don't have. And we have that opportunity largely because of the amount of vacant land in the city of Detroit. So we have a huge number of people who are engaged on some level in agriculture and beginning to think more critically about the food system. That provides us with a tremendous opportunity. We also have some people who are beginning to do things like seed saving. And somebody Wednesday night mentioned the term seed sovereignty, which we think is very important. And there's been a lot of work done on this. Vandana Shiva, of course, has talked extensively about the impact of the control of seeds by Monsanto and other demonic forces. We also have a tremendous number of vacant buildings in the city of Detroit, and people are beginning to experiment with things like aquaponics and vertical gardening and what have you. So there's tremendous opportunities both in terms of kind of more traditional agriculture, planting and soil, and also some of the newer technologies that people are experimenting with. We have the Detroit Food Policy Council, which is unique in that it was not created by the city government. It was created by a grassroots organization and has representatives who actually represent the grassroots community. And Winona, are you still here? We have the executive director, by the way, of the Detroit Food Policy Council, Winona Bynum, back here. And we have a number of people who are involved in cooking and food preparation and food storage and what have. So we have tremendous opportunities in the city of Detroit. We also have a very robust history of resistance. And so, you know, all farms are not the same, let me say that. But we have kind of this history of resistance that our organization identifies and connects with. And we would hope that more and more and more that the people doing this agricultural work in the city of Detroit would connect themselves with this great history of resistance that exists in the city of Detroit. But we also have some real challenges. And the biggest of those challenges is what I mentioned earlier, the dirty, rotten system of capitalism, and also this global system of white supremacy. And I could really do a talk on that by itself, but I'm going to be respectful of the time constraints I've been given. But I will say this, that we still have this global system that continues to give unearned privilege to people who are identified as white in this society. And I think we all know that race is not a biological reality, it's a social construct. But within this social construct, people who are identified as white certainly continue to have unearned privilege, access to resources that the rest of us don't have. And so people who identify as white have a tremendous work to do to rid themselves of the thinking, the superiority which is deeply embedded in their minds that's associated with being part of this system. On the other hand, African Americans and other people of color have a tremendous amount of work to do also, because we have what we sometimes call internalized oppression, that we have bought into many of these ideas that suggest that we have diminished value as human beings. And it's almost ridiculous to talk about food sovereignty without talking about sovereignty in general. And so really this concept of sovereignty is that you have the right to self-rule and self-definition, and you certainly can't have that if you see yourself in a diminished way. And so the work of creating food sovereignty in the city of Detroit is connected to this work of uplifting our humanity, of uplifting this notion that we are human beings that are worthy of the best along with everybody else on the face of the earth. So we also have this major dilemma that faces the whole food movement, if in fact this is a movement, and that is that how do we provide affordable, high quality, healthy food while at the same time making sure that workers within the food system are paid a fair wage? It's a heck of a dilemma. I'm not sure what the solution to that is. I'm not sure there is a solution within the context of capitalism. We have the challenges that I mentioned of land grabbing in the city of Detroit, and we're pushing back very hard. One of the reasons we're pushing back hard also is because we realize that the eyes of the world in many ways are on the city of Detroit. Detroit has become the poster child for urban decay. And so many people from throughout the United States and from throughout the world travel to Detroit on a regular basis to see, some are traveling to see the decay, but many are also traveling to see the solutions that are being implemented by community members and look at how we are redefining our community. And so there's tremendous national, international attention on the city of Detroit. So many of us who are active realize that that gives us a tremendous obligation to begin to create solutions that are rooted in justice and equity, so that as other people throughout the world are looking at how they'll solve similar problems, they also will root their movements for solving those problems within justice and equity. I mentioned briefly water rights, huge struggle. We're, of course, like everyone else, affected by climate chaos. And then we have the challenge of developing a cadre of farmers and support staff who have the skills and knowledge really to produce huge amounts of food. You know, a lot of people have romantic notions about farming, but farming is, you have to be highly skilled, and there's all kind of variables that you have to be prepared to deal with. So we're in the process, and when I say we, I mean collectively, the people engaged in this work in the city of Detroit, of developing this cadre of people with this set of skills and knowledge to make this happen, but we really have to ramp that up. And then, of course, farming is just one level of the food system, and particularly as we're talking about generating wealth and how communities generate wealth that can help the community rise as a whole, we have to look at those middle layers in the food system where the food is washed and packed and processed, where the majority of the wealth is generated. So we have the challenge of building that infrastructure which supports the farmers. So in my final conclusion, the first one was just the fake conclusion, right? These are some of the imperatives that I see for moving the work of food sovereignty in the city of Detroit forward. And the first is that we need discipline and zeal. I mentioned that I, in many ways, come out of the 1960s, and so I still probably see things in fairly paramilitary terms. I see this really as being a war, and largely we're being warred upon, actually, is what's going on by the corporate structure. And to fight against that, we can't do it in a haphazard manner. We have to be very disciplined. We have to have almost an unexhaustible source of energy. We have to have enthusiasm, and we can't let anything stop us. So that's one of the things that we need to build more, you know, rather than just seeing ourselves as growing food, really seeing ourselves as being involved in a struggle to redeem ourselves. But at the same time, one of the things I've learned from younger people is that while we have this zeal and this discipline and that we work very hard, that we also have to be concerned about self-care so that we're sustaining ourselves for the long term. But we also have to have organization. Clearly, as I mentioned, I'm very much rooted within the Black Liberation Movement. One of our great teachers, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, always urged us to organize, organize, organize. We can't fight against a very highly organized, oppressive structure unless we have organizations that are intentionally fighting against it. And so I would urge for those of you who are seriously involved in this struggle that you align yourself with an organization. We would, of course, like you to have some affiliation with the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. But if you don't like what we're doing, align yourself with some other organization which is moving in a progressive way. And if you don't see an organization which is doing the work that you think needs to be done, then create one. But this is not individual work. It has to be done collectively, and we need organizations to make that happen. To build a movement, we need common values and vision. So everyone in Detroit doing agriculture work is not anti-capitalist, believe me. And so if we're going to truly have a movement, we have to define what those values are and what our vision for the future is and build buy-in around those values and vision. And then clearly we have to have some specific goals and objectives. Brother Jahi the other night talked about the need for political objectives, and he gave the example of the civil rights movement and how there were symbols that were more an emblem that were able to galvanize people around them, particular struggles that helped to build the movement. And so we need to do the same thing. We need to set specific targets and really work towards those goals and objectives. And then we need to realize that kind of the struggle is twofold, that on one level we're fighting against a very oppressive system and what we're against, but at the same time, and probably more importantly, we're building a new reality. We are building what we are for. And both things have to happen simultaneously. We can't use all of our time on the picket line, chanting against Monsanto and others who are, trying to destroy the planet, although that's important. I don't want to minimize it. That's important. But we can't spend all of our time responding and reacting. We have to spend the majority of our time creating the reality that we want. We have to, as Malcolm X advised, internationalize our struggle. It's very important that we link the struggles of African Americans and other people within the United States who are struggling for food sovereignty, within those with those struggles in the global South, with people who are struggling also for food sovereignty and for land rights and for water rights. And then finally, I'd just like to say that we need to continue to have meaningful and constructive and creative collaborations between academics who often have a great deal of knowledge about very specific things with the practitioners who are on the ground. And we need to find what the needs are of the practitioners on the ground that the academics can provide knowledge to inform. So I want to thank you for your time and your patience. I think I went a little bit over, but we want to encourage you to visit D-Town Farm and support the efforts of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network.